Good evening. We're going to have a little less formal video this evening talking about the first axial period. And I don't want to spend too much time on it before we go on to my discussion of my conception of the second great axial period, that we are in a great axial period. And I'm very anxious to discuss really the second axial period. As we said, Zarathustra was sort of the grandfather of the first axial period, and I'm going to take Galileo as the grandfather of the new axial period. We'll talk about the great shift between the time from Galileo to Stephen Hawking and beyond. Now, there's some interesting things to think about in the first axial period, because it took place at a time when you had organized city-states and some of the petty empires in the beginning, and went through the great imperial period. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, Egypt, and through Alexander the Great and into the present, the imperial age, which ended effectively with the First World War, but the decolonization that took place after the Second World War, which was much more rapid and profound. When we look at the axial era, we see this huge transformation in thought. And the great leaders, the architects really of the axial period, most of them became prominent at a time when there was great stress, a war, an invasion, an impending invasion, some catastrophe of some kind. And also, when you had governments forming, you were moving from the priest-king into the god-king, or the king, who somehow gained prominence over the high priests, and you formed more modern types of city-states and societies and civilizations. Now, in the process of it, there was a large gap that developed between the lower classes and the nobles and those who surrounded the king immediately. So much of what was taking place during the first axial period was social critique, and a real criticism and critique of society and culture as it was forming. And this was because the thinkers of the era, who had now the luxury of developing philosophy and of thinking seriously about personhood and structures of civilization, were all concerned with social justice. This was a very great concern in the first axial period. You had local authorities, elaborate town planning, advanced metalwork, all these other things, but there was a profound tension between political powers and intellectual movements. And we notice that the thinkers were trying to, of the axial period, and really the architects of the axial period, were actually trying to introduce a greater sense of justice. And here we're talking about social justice, not hanging people or executing people. A greater perfection in mankind, a more universal understanding of things. All of this was unfolding in this axial period. And at the same time, we had the Greek tragedians, many of the great Greek plays developed, and this era was famous in Greece, the later part of it anyway, for the theater, which really examined very deep human psychological issues, even psychiatric issues. And we'll get to talking about those a little later. And the concern with social justice is very striking. The critique of the political structures of society. And at this time, we were going to move on to Israel, Palestine, and particularly to the prophet Isaiah, who really in many ways typifies this era. I want to mention, though, briefly, we'll talk about him later, Confucius. In China, Confucius began his work during the era of the warring states, where there was constant turmoil and warfare between the various Chinese states. And Confucius, who never in his lifetime developed a huge following, nevertheless had an enormous influence on the future of Chinese culture and thought. And he also was a critique of the political structures, but Confucius was very much concerned with developing a philosophy of not really the perfect man, but the way people should interact with one another, the kind of reverence or respect they should have for elders, and the way rulers should actually rule. Confucius took books like the I Ching, that is the Book of Changes, which was quite ancient, but was used mostly for fortune-telling and soothsaying. And Confucius took that and turned it into a philosophical text. He reshaped it and made profound improvements on it in the philosophical sense. But so he was working in China during this era, and also in an era of great tensions and strife. The prophet Isaiah was prophesying just before the Assyrian invasion, which ultimately destroyed the northern kingdom. You'll remember that the 10 tribes just simply vanished. Ephraim ceased to exist as an entity of any kind. And Isaiah was warning Judea. Hosea and Amos were trying to warn the kingdom of Israel at the time, but Isaiah was working in Judea. And Isaiah was trying to prevent Judea from taking sides in a war, particularly with the anti-Assyrian group. And of course, Egypt was afraid of the empire of Assyria and was trying to drag all of its client states, like Gaza and along Palestine into Lebanon and Judea and Israel, trying to goad them into becoming a real buffer and fighting against Assyria. And Isaiah was telling Judah, just be quiet, just be calm, don't get involved. Just stay here, be insignificant, be out of the way, and don't concern yourself with this. But in Isaiah 10:1 through, the first 2 verses of Isaiah, the 10th chapter, I want to actually read this because it gives a real insight into some of the most significant thought that was going on during this first Axial Era. Isaiah the prophet says, "Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of their rights and withhold justice from the oppressed among my people." These critiques of the political structure and society are extremely important because they're really the beginning of the development of human rights. They're really the forces that shaped later philosophies to give us things like our Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada and the rather lesser Bill of Rights in the United States and even the United Nations Charter of Rights. So when we talk about this great Axial Era, we're really talking about the development of social thought, of the critique of governments, of the critique of politics, of the critique of the structures of society, by men who we call prophets because they had the courage. And they could speak to kings and rulers and emperors, often without fear. Sometimes they paid a supreme price, but they did speak without fear. And this is particularly true in Israel and in Judea, where the prophets were divinely inspired and speaking in the name of the God of Israel, in the name of the God of Judea, and trying to counsel in a way that would actually bring people to a better understanding of God and what God was really all about. We'll notice in the holy prophets that we get a rather different view and understanding than we do from, say, Judges, Chronicles, the books of Kings, and all these others. When the prophets speak, we hear things like, woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who neglect the widows, the poor, and the orphans, and to those who deprive the poor of their rights. And these are words that we should really remember. We're going to see some of this also in the second axial period, but we're also going to see a shift in the whole structure of human thought. And particularly in the 21st century, when we'll actually see some transformation in the human brain and the way the brain becomes wired. And this is very significant for us, not to lose track of these very significant ideas and ideals from this first great axial era. And we're going to read a little bit more in the next broadcast on this from some of the holy prophets, but particularly Isaiah, because in my view, Isaiah really typifies this first axial period from the point of view of the concept of the critique of society and social issues, the critique of politics and of government, and of the structures of society. What the Greeks at Miletus were doing is something radically different. And they're of great significance as the foundation of the philosophies that came to us in Western Europe and even in North America later on. But theoretically, the scripture also has a profound influence on how we think and how we approach society and culture. So it's very important to read what the holy prophets had to say about it and think about it in that context, but also to compare it with the things that Confucius was teaching, the things that the Zoroastrian, the followers of Zoroaster, his disciples were teaching in the Indo-Aryan world. Not so much Buddha, because Buddha was more interested in sort of being outside of society and culture. But in the Hindu world, we also had the critiques of society and culture. And this is one of the more significant aspects of this whole axial era. People are thinking about how life should be structured, how government should be structured, and what their obligations were, not simply what the rights of nobles and kings were. And it took centuries before this really developed into any kind of concrete concept or system of human rights, of the rights of individuals, and also of commonweal, that is the common good of the whole society, from the poorest to the richest, and not the wealthiest only. So as we continue this study, we'll move very soon now into discussions of the second axial period, but we're going to read from Isaiah and Ezekiel, from Hosea, and a few others, and compare that with some of the earlier thought in further east. And also take a brief look at the impact of the Egyptian ideals on religion and theology, and then go to the great Greek tragedians, the ones who wrote these plays which had an almost startling insight into human psychology and the structure of the human mind at the time, and the temptations and the problems that humans get themselves into. And then look also at, well, first Miletus, but then the other philosophers who came upon such ideas as atomic theory in a rather primitive fashion, but nevertheless had by intuition and insight that there was some kind of a particle that was atomos. You couldn't split it or cut it beneath a certain size. And this atomic theory, by intuition, it was the intuition of these Greek philosophers in science that can really amaze and astonish us. Because without the equipment that we had later, their minds could penetrate by thinking deeply, by observing things around them, and by seeking the great answers to the great problem of permanence and change. We wouldn't even get into the architecture of the ancient world, because the architecture of the ancient world is far more stunning than anything that has been created in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, 21st century, because it was done by hand. It was done without the equipment, without the computers, without the CAD programs, without any of the kind of materials that we have in our day, and yet incomparable structures were built and created with a deep understanding of geometry and other mathematical sciences, which were arrived at by the power of the human mind, which sometimes we think they had a power of thought and a power of understanding, but most of all a power of remembering, of handing down information and knowledge generation by generation in oral form as they gradually invented and developed writing, in which things could be transmitted by writing. And the accomplishments in the ancient era of this great axial period are really still to this day so stunning and so startling. And we think of all that our technology has accomplished in these recent centuries, and we forget that they had a technology which was equally astonishing and which accomplished feats that we perhaps could not even accomplish today, because we've given things over to machinery, to cranes, to welding, to driving rivets, and all of this, and building buildings that cannot stand the test of time so well as many of the ancient structures and buildings have. So this is also a part of this axial era. The mind of mankind began to penetrate so deeply into the realities and into the abstract, and to come up with concepts and ideas and ways of building and ways of forming and solving problems that we, with all of our equipment and machinery, sometimes fail to solve. And this is something that we have to think about and look back with a great deal of respect toward the ancients and toward this great axial era, when so much so profoundly developed that made it possible for us to build upon that foundation and come to the point where we are today, and now seeing ourselves shifting away from the paradigms and many of the concepts of that great axial era. We find ourselves in a second axial era, which is also astonishing and also very profound, and which really gives us a perspective not simply on the world around us, but a whole new concept of the universe itself. So that now we're thinking outside of what can be seen with the naked eye. We're thinking outside of the formulas and the mythologies that were created to try to explain the inexplicable in the heavens above us. And we're thinking on this great universal scale and about the intricacies of the universe itself. And now not how we fit into this world around us, but how we fit into the universe. And so we'll get on to that era topic shortly, but we'll have about 3 more broadcasts about the first axial period first, because it really is so worth studying and so worth understanding the nobility and the greatness of the human spirit. And seeing it in that setting makes it somehow more profound. And I hope that people who are watching or people who are interested in this will rather grasp this aspect as well. Thank you all, and God bless you. And we thank you for watching our YouTube channel, and we do welcome your comments and your critiques and any suggestions or questions that you might have. So thank you all, God bless you, and good night.